be like
This
that.
is your man.
Yes,
Look at the screen.
that's mine. And
And
I'm going to stick beside him.
and that's what you're going to settle for.
I'm going to stick beside him.
Daniel Hill lived in Little Rock, Arkansas. He was remembered as a young man with a gentle nature who cared about the people close to him. He was not known for violence or crime. Daniel's life was centered around family, friends, and building a simple future. He became part of the story only because of who he loved. In 2012, Daniel was in a relationship with Edwina Brown. The two spent time together as a couple, enjoying a bond that appeared normal from the outside. Daniel had no idea that being with Edwina would place him in the path of danger. His life was cut short when he was attacked, leaving behind family and friends who never expected such a sudden end. Edwina Brown was also living in Little Rock. She was a young woman building her own life, connected to her community and relationships. Before dating Daniel, she had been in a relationship with Danny Brown. After moving forward with someone new, her past followed her in a way she could not escape. Edwina's world changed when violence entered it in 2012. She survived a deadly shooting that claimed Daniel's life. Her survival became the turning point that shaped everything that happened afterward. Though she escaped death once, her decisions after that night tied her future to the same man who had plotted against her. Danny.
This is your man.
Yes,
Look at the screen.
that's mine. And
And
I'm going to stick beside him.
that's what you're going to settle for.
I'm going to stick beside him.
Daniel. Payments were exchanged in money and property to carry out the attack. The connection between these three people would not only define a single night in 2012, but also stretch forward more than a decade. Daniel Hill lost his life in the crossfire of another man's rage. Edwina Brown endured, but her path led back to the one who nearly destroyed her. Danny Brown stood at the center of both lives, shaping their fates through violence. Their background explained how ordinary people in an ordinary city became linked to a case that revealed betrayal, control, and tragedy. Daniel, the young man with plans for tomorrow, was taken too soon. Edwina, the survivor, would later become a victim. Danny, the ex, held the thread that tied them all together. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from? What are your thoughts as this story unfolds? Your voice matters. These are real people, real tragedies, and real lessons we can't ignore. Share this video with someone you care about. It could make all the difference. Welcome to Unseen Crime Dossiers, your home for spine-chilling cases, haunting before mysteries, and deep dives into the world of crime. From jaw-dropping real-life events to groundbreaking forensic discoveries, we're here to uncover the truth behind the most gripping investigations. Step inside, examine the evidence, and lose yourself in the shadows of true crime. On a night in 2012, violence broke into the lives of two people who had no reason to expect it. Daniel Hill and Edwina Brown were together when gunmen approached them. What should have been an ordinary evening turned into an ambush that would forever change both of their lives. The shooters were not random. They had been hired to carry out a planned mission. Their target was clear, and their orders had been arranged beforehand. The hitmen struck with speed, leaving little time for Daniel or Edwina to react. Shots were fired without warning, tearing apart the quiet of the street. Daniel was hit fatally. He died at the scene, leaving no chance for rescue or recovery. His life ended in an instant, and his future disappeared that same night. Family members and friends were left to grieve the loss of someone who had done nothing to deserve the fate handed to him. Edwina, however, survived the attack. The bullets did not take her life, but they left her with injuries and trauma that she would carry forward. Though she lived through the shooting, survival brought its own consequences. From that moment on, her story was no longer separate from the violence arranged against her. Police investigations moved quickly. The shooters were captured and confessed. They revealed that the assault was not random but paid for. They admitted they were hired to complete the deadly task, and even disclosed what they had been given in exchange for their role. Their words pointed directly to the man behind the attack. That man was Danny Brown. Evidence showed he had offered both money and property as payment. The The confession of the hitmen named him as the one who set the attack in motion. With the killers in custody and testimony in hand, the truth appeared undeniable. The shooting was more than just a crime. It was a turning point that erased one life, scarred another, and exposed the depth of betrayal at the center of the case. What happened that night set into motion a chain of events that would stretch far beyond 2012, leading to decisions and outcomes no one could have predicted. After the deadly shooting, the case gained strength when the men responsible gave full statements. Their words were detailed and specific. They explained how they had been promised money and property in return for carrying out the job. This direct link to the one who ordered the attack gave investigators the evidence they needed. With this information, the law turned its focus on Danny Brown. Court records showed that charges were filed against him for arranging the killing. For many, this was a moment where justice seemed possible. The confessions connected him directly to the plan, and the crime was no longer hidden behind the hands of hired men. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy as details came forward. Payments were described, promises were laid out, and the entire structure of the plan was revealed. Each piece of evidence stacked against him, making the case stronger. It appeared the path was clear and conviction would follow. Prosecutors prepared to move forward with the charges. They held the words of the shooters, the promise of cash and land, and the proof that Danny had set the tragedy in motion. To them, the matter seemed complete. The attacker had been identified, and the case was positioned to close in a decisive way. But in situations involving close personal ties, legal matters often take unexpected turns. While the evidence looked strong on paper, what came next would disrupt everything. The case was still bound to the choices of one person, and her decision would soon rewrite the future of the trial. The focus shifted away from the hired men, who had already admitted their roles. All eyes turned back to Edwina Brown, the one who had lived through the attack. Her voice held the power to move the case forward or bring it to a halt. The confessions of the hitmen had laid the foundation. The charges had been built upon them. Yet the strength of the entire case would rest on whether the survivor of the assault was willing to take the stand and speak against the man accused of arranging her pain. What happened next shocked even those closest to the case. Only 2 weeks after the charges were filed, Edwina made a decision that turned the entire story upside down. She stood before officials and chose to marry Danny Brown, the man accused of planning her death. This act stunned the community and changed the legal process immediately. As his wife, she could no longer be forced to speak against him in court. Her decision removed the strongest piece of testimony that prosecutors had hoped to use. The foundation of the case collapsed almost overnight. The wedding itself was quiet, but its impact was loud. By joining him, Edwina cut the last thread holding the charges together. Without her cooperation, the case could not move forward, and the system was left with little choice. The charges that once seemed solid were dismissed, and Danny Brown walked free. For observers, the turn of events was difficult to grasp. Just weeks earlier, the evidence had painted him as the one behind the deadly scheme. Now, with a marriage certificate signed, he was no longer facing trial. The move placed him back in her life, not as an accused planner of violence, but as her legal husband. From that moment forward, their story was no longer about law, but about a household built on an uneasy past. The tragedy of Daniel Hill's death faded from the courtroom and into silence, as the spotlight now turned on the new union that had risen from the case. The years ahead would hold the weight of that choice. For Edwina, the marriage was both a shield that kept her husband out of prison and a chain that tied her to the man once accused of arranging her death. That twist would define the next chapter of her life. The legal record closed the book on the case. What remained was a marriage marked not by beginnings but by the shadow of violence, a partnership born in the aftermath of death and courtroom drama. After the wedding, life continued in ways few could have imagined. Edwina and Danny settled into their roles as husband and wife, raising their children under the same roof. To the outside world, their home looked like any other, with routines shaped by family needs and daily responsibilities. Over the years, the story of the courtroom and the dismissed charges faded into the background. Neighbors saw a family that attended gatherings, celebrated milestones, and appeared to move forward. Time created distance between the violent events of the past and the image of stability they tried to maintain. Inside their household, The dynamic was complicated. Trust had once been shattered, yet a partnership remained in place. The years passed slowly, layer by layer, as they built a shared life. The connection was tied not only to their marriage certificate, but also to the children who linked them together. From the outside, there was little sign of the dark history that had surrounded them. Holidays, school activities, and community functions gave the appearance of normalcy. For more than a decade, they lived with the balance of ordinary family life resting against the shadow of what had come before. Each year added weight to the decision made back in 2012. The world moved on and new stories filled the news, while this family carried their private truth in silence. To many, they blended into everyday life, no different from other households on the block. Those 11 years built a picture of endurance. The memory of Daniel Hill's death remained locked away, overshadowed by the demands of raising children and maintaining a marriage. The community, too, seemed to forget as the couple's life blended into the ordinary rhythm of time. For Edwina, those years formed a chapter defined not by courts or headlines, but by the quiet routine of being a wife and mother. It was a life that, on the surface, looked far removed from the violence that had once threatened to erase it. On March 27th, 2023, the quiet routine that had defined their lives came to a sudden and violent end. That evening, Danny Brown turned a gun on his wife inside their home. The shots ended Edwina's life, closing a story that had begun more than a decade earlier. Police arrived quickly after the gunfire, responding to emergency calls from the scene. Inside, they discovered Edwina lifeless, her body marked by the violence she had once escaped but could not avoid forever. Danny Brown was still present when officers entered, and he was taken into custody. The children, caught in the middle of the chaos, were forced to witness the destruction of their family. What had once been an ordinary household was now transformed into a crime scene. The home, which had carried the weight of so many secrets, was finally stripped bare of its silence. News of the killing spread quickly, capturing the attention of both the community and beyond. The story of a woman who had once survived a plot against her life, only to be killed years later by the same man, was too striking to ignore. Headlines traced the arc of her life back to 2012, drawing attention to the choices and events that shaped this ending. Authorities documented the scene carefully, collecting evidence that would later be used in court. Photographs, shell casings, and witness statements formed a clear record of what had taken place. The timeline of the evening was pieced together, leaving little doubt about how the tragedy unfolded. Danny Brown faced the full weight of the law once again, only this time without the chance of avoiding the consequences. His arrest marked the conclusion of a marriage built on shadows and the beginning of a new chapter in the criminal justice system. For Edwina, the end came inside the very space where she had built her life for more than a decade. The final breaking point was not in the courtroom, nor in the whispered warnings of the past, but in the quiet of her own home. The news of Edwina Brown's death echoed across her community with shock and disbelief. Neighbors who had once exchanged greetings with the couple now watched in silence as investigators carried out their work. The home that had once appeared ordinary was now surrounded by flashing lights and marked by police tape. Local media outlets reported the story widely, tracing the unusual history that led to this outcome. Reporters highlighted the earlier events from 2012, pointing out how unresolved choices had resurfaced more than a decade later. The narrative drew attention far beyond the city, sparking discussions about the cycle of violence hidden behind closed doors. Family members of both Edwina and Danny were left to deal with the consequences. Loved ones of Edwina struggled with grief, forced to process the loss of a daughter, mother, and relative. For Danny's side, the burden of having one of their own connected to such an act became an unavoidable reality. Community leaders responded with calls for awareness and change. They pointed to the tragedy as an example of how silence can conceal danger for years before breaking into the open. Churches, advocacy groups, and local organizations gathered to provide support to children and to extend comfort to those most affected. In the days following, tributes appeared online and in person. Friends shared memories of Edwina's kindness, her strength, and her devotion to her family. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes collected outside her home served as reminders that her life had meaning beyond the way it ended. Legal authorities prepared their case against Danny, moving the process into a formal investigation and charges. His arrest shifted the focus from speculation to the certainty of a trial ahead. The public waited for updates, following every detail as the justice system prepared to hold him accountable. The community, still stunned, attempted to regain its balance. The story of Edwina Brown and Daniel Hill had stretched across more than a decade, but its final chapter left a mark that could not be erased. Danny Brown's trial began with heavy attention from the public and the press. The courtroom filled with attorneys, reporters, and onlookers eager to witness how the case would unfold. Security was tight, and the weight of the events that had led to this point was felt in every corner of the room. The prosecution presented its evidence, starting with the details of Edwina's death. They outlined the sequence of events on March 27, 2023, when police were called to the Browns' home. Crime scene photos, witness accounts, and forensic findings were all displayed to build a narrative that Danny had deliberately taken his wife's life. Prosecutors also reintroduced elements of the 2012 case, explaining how Danny had once been accused of hiring hitmen. They described how those earlier accusations connected to the current charge, portraying a long pattern of violence. The jury was asked to consider not just the act of murder, but the history that led to it. The defense countered by attempting to separate the two events. Attorneys argued that what happened in 2012 had no direct bearing on the 2023 crime. They focused on undermining the reliability of witnesses and suggesting that the case lacked clear motive beyond speculation. Still, the weight of the past remained in the minds of those watching. Testimony from law enforcement officers, medical examiners, and neighbors added to the record. Each statement helped piece together what investigators believed happened in the hours before the shooting. The evidence painted a picture of escalating tension that finally erupted into irreversible violence. The children of Edwina and Danny, though not directly present in court, remained at the center of concern. Their future was now tied to the outcome of the trial, as they faced life without their mother and with their father on the other side of the courtroom. Support systems were discussed quietly outside of the proceedings, as the community braced for the verdict. The trial continued for several days, moving through evidence, cross-examinations, and final arguments. By the time closing statements were delivered, the case had laid bare a decade-long chain of choices and consequences. The jury was left with the responsibility of determining justice, and the weight of that decision hung in the silence of the courtroom. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Family members of both the victim and the accused sat quietly, waiting for the words that would determine the outcome. The judge called for order, and the four-person jury stood to read the decision. Danny Brown was found guilty of murdering his wife, Edwina. The declaration was clear, leaving no doubt about the conclusion the jury had reached after hearing the evidence. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of the verdict sank in. The sentencing phase followed soon after. Prosecutors argued for the maximum punishment, citing the seriousness of the crime and Danny's history of violence. They reminded the court of the pattern that had developed over years, ending in tragedy that could not be undone. The defense requested leniency, pointing to Danny's role as a father and the impact his absence would have on his children. They urged the court to consider the broader consequences of the punishment being handed down. The judge reviewed both sides before delivering the sentence. With careful language, the court emphasized that the crime was deliberate and irreversible. Danny Brown was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, with no possibility of parole. As the words were spoken, some family members wept while others stared forward in silence. The sentence closed one chapter of a long and complicated story, but it left behind a trail of loss that no verdict could erase. The trial's conclusion marked the final step in a case that had stretched over more than a decade. With Danny Brown removed from society, the legal process reached its end, though the personal pain of those involved continued well beyond the courtroom walls. After the trial ended, attention shifted to the children left behind. They had lost their mother in the most violent way, and now their father was taken from them by the justice system. Their lives changed completely as they faced a world without either parent at home. Family members stepped in to provide care. Relatives opened their doors and offered stability in the midst of uncertainty. The goal was to give the children a sense of safety, even though nothing could replace what had been taken from them. The community also offered support. Neighbors, teachers, and friends rallied around, providing meals, donations, and guidance. Efforts were made to ensure the children remained connected to school and daily routines. These small actions helped to build a new structure in their lives. Counselors became involved to address the emotional toll. Professionals worked with the children to understand the trauma and process their feelings in healthy ways. The sessions focused on giving them tools to cope with loss and navigate the challenges that would continue as they grew older. Legal proceedings regarding guardianship followed. Courts determined who would assume full responsibility for the children's upbringing. The process was designed to balance stability with their best interests, ensuring they would not be left without clear direction. In time, the children began to adjust to new surroundings. They faced the ongoing reality of growing up with the shadow of their parents' story always present. Despite that, efforts continued to help them find a path forward that was not defined solely by tragedy. The future remained uncertain, but the children carried on with the support of those around them. Each step taken was aimed at helping them build a life beyond the events that had shaped their past, keeping them focused on progress rather than pain. Here at Unseen Crime Dossiers, we're driven by a mission to uncover hidden realities, honor forgotten voices, and keep their memories alive. If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something, there's more coming that will challenge you even deeper. Make sure to hit subscribe, tap the like button, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss a case. We're dropping new episodes regularly, and trust us, what's ahead is even more chilling. Before you go, we want to hear from you. What moment hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments. Your perspective matters, and your voice helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay alert, stay informed, and never stop seeking the truth, because every life deserves to be heard.